Some of the views expressed on the Mormon Channel are solely for the education and inspiration of our audience and may not represent the official position of the Church.
I'm Nathan Wright, and you're listening to the Mormon Channel of The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. John Taylor, the third president of The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, was the only president not born in America. He was born in 1808 to religiously zealous parents who belonged to the Church of England. When John was christened, his godmother and godfather said they wanted this boy to reject the corruptions of the world and become a true servant of God. In his early teens, he was appointed as a lay preacher to preach and exhort in the English villages he traveled through. He felt a certain lack of understanding of what he was teaching. He said the Spirit was urging him to go to America and preach the gospel. In 1830, the parents of John Taylor, together with his brothers and sisters, sailed from Liverpool for Canada. John was left in England to settle affairs and to dispose of some of his father's property. It was 2 years before John could join them. John joined the Methodist Church in Toronto and soon became a class leader and itinerant preacher for that organization. It was while John was attending the meetings of the Methodist Church he met and married Leonora Cannon, daughter of Captain George Cannon. Leonora was refined, educated, and deeply religious. It wasn't long before the doctrines of the Methodist faith failed to satisfy both of them. It was at this critical time that Parley P. Pratt, an apostle of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, arrived in Toronto. Elder Pratt began holding meetings at the home of a Mrs. Walton. John and Leonora Taylor were among those who attended. John said he felt Mormonism was emotionalism and a cock and bull story.
John wrote down 6 sermons which Apostle Pratt preached and compared them with Scripture. He also investigated the evidence of the divine authenticity of the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants. Brother Taylor said, "I made a regular business of it for 3 weeks and followed Brother Pratt from place to place." B. H. Roberts.
John and Leonora Taylor were baptized on May 9, 1836, by Parley P. Pratt. John immediately became an active member of the church, and within a few weeks he was ordained an elder. Together he and Elder Pratt began preaching in the countryside around Toronto. When Elder Pratt left for home in Kirtland in the fall of 1836, he left Elder Taylor in charge of all the saints and branches in Upper Canada. In March 1837, Elder Taylor traveled to Kirtland to visit the saints and meet the prophet Joseph Smith for the first time. On his arrival, the prophet received him cordially and entertained him in his own home. This was the beginning of a friendship that was to continue throughout the prophet's lifetime. In August of 1837, the prophet Joseph, accompanied by Sidney Rigdon and Thomas B. Marsh, paid a return visit to John Taylor in Canada.
This was as great a treat to me as I ever enjoyed. I had daily opportunity of conversing with, of listening to their instructions, and in participating in the rich store of intelligence that flowed continually from the prophet Joseph. John Taylor.
Before the prophet left Canada, he ordained Elder Taylor to the office of high priest and reappointed him to preside over the church there. In the fall of 1837, Elder Taylor received word from the prophet that he would like to have him wind up his affairs in Canada and join the saints in Missouri. Elder Taylor left his comfortable home in Toronto. He fitted a covered sled for his family and headed to Far West. It was while he was making the trip from Canada that Joseph Smith received revelation calling Elder Taylor to be an apostle. The persecution of the saints by the Missouri settlers was at its height at the time John Taylor arrived at Far West. It was a month later that Joseph Smith and several leaders of the church were taken prisoner by the mob militia, and all the saints in Missouri were ordered to leave the state. On December 19, 1838, John Taylor was ordained an apostle by Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball. John and Leonora moved once again, this time to Quincy, Illinois. Shortly thereafter, the city of Nauvoo was established by the prophet Joseph, and Elder Taylor and his family moved again. In Nauvoo, the Taylors could not find appropriate accommodations, so they crossed the river to the Iowa side and moved into one room of an old military barracks. It was at this time that John Taylor was called on a mission to England. He made his way, ill and penniless, but by the strength of his great character and testimony, he succeeded bringing many families to the gospel. Elder Taylor continued to work in England until April 1841.
I feel to rejoice before God that He has blessed my humble endeavors to promote His cause and kingdom, and for all the blessings I have received from this land. For although I have traveled so far in this country on railroads, coaches, steamboats, wagons, on horseback, and almost every way, and have been amongst strangers and in strange lands, I have never for once been at a loss for either money, clothes, friends, or a home. Neither have I ever asked a person for a farthing. Thus I have proved the Lord, and I know that He is according to His word. John Taylor.
Upon his arrival in Nauvoo on the 1st of July, 1841, John discovered that his wife was living in distressing conditions and in poor health, but under his competent care, Leonora soon recovered. Elder Taylor became active in all the affairs of the church. He spent many hours with the prophet, with whom he formed a close friendship. In February 1842, the church purchased the printing office of the Times and Seasons, and the prophet requested John Taylor and Wilford Woodruff manage the publication. Throughout the year of 1843, Elder Taylor continued as publisher. One of his challenges was to obtain enough paper. When the Mississippi River was frozen over in the winter, it was impossible to get any freight into Nauvoo. For example, one issue read,
We have to apologize to our readers for this number issued so much later than the day of publication. We had run short of paper, expecting that the river would have opened long before it did, and as it was impossible with the state of the roads to bring it by land, we had no other alternative but to wait until the river opened. We are sorry for the delay, but assure our friends that it was unavoidable on our part. Every arrangement, however, is entered into that is necessary to make up for lost time, as we have engaged 2 sets of hands to keep the work progressing night and day until the time is made up, which we expect will be about 3 weeks. John Taylor.
The year 1844 was a presidential year. It was the decision of the leaders of the saints that Joseph Smith should be a candidate for President of the United States. 244 elders, including all of the 12 apostles except John Taylor and Willard Richards, left Nauvoo and traveled to the various states in the East to labor for his election. Willard Richards was the church historian and was chosen to stay behind because he was charged with keeping accurate records and bringing the history of the church up to date. John Taylor had to stay in Nauvoo to publish the Times and Seasons paper. While the majority of church leaders were away, an anti-Mormon newspaper was established in Nauvoo which attacked the prophet and the saints. The Nauvoo City Council ordered the paper to be destroyed, which was carried out. Warrants were immediately issued for the arrest of the prophet, his brother Hiram, John Taylor, and others who were members of the city council. It was after their arrest and while awaiting trial that the prophet Joseph and his brother Hiram were killed, and John Taylor was wounded by a mob that stormed Carthage jail. Joseph and Hiram were shot 5 times, as was John Taylor. A day after the shooting, James W. Woods, Joseph's attorney, examined the walls of the jail and counted 36 holes, places where the attackers had missed their targets. John Taylor was moved and treated for his wounds.
It was with difficulty that sufficient persons could be found to carry me to the tavern, for immediately after the murder, a great fear fell upon all the people, and men, women, and children fled with great precipitation, leaving nothing nor anybody in the town but 2 or 3 women and children, and 1 or 2 sick persons. John Taylor.
They made a special carrier for him, a kind of sled. They had to avoid the road and go as smoothly as possible over the prairie grass, and somehow he endured the pain. Later, Elder Taylor was taken to his home in Nauvoo to recover from his wounds. It was many weeks before he was able to resume his normal work. Council meetings of the 12 were frequently held at his house while he was recovering. Members of the Carthage mob were eventually tried, proceedings in which John Taylor participated, but no one was convicted. It was known to the leading brethren of the church that the saints would have to leave Nauvoo, and so in the fall and winter of 1845 to 1846, preparations were begun for the migration west. On July 14, 1846, Elder Taylor arrived in Council Bluffs on the Missouri River after traveling 4 months in the rain and mud. It was at this time word was received that the church in England was not going well. John Taylor, Orson Hyde, and Orson Pratt were requested by President Young to leave for England and see that the church was running as it should. The brethren left for England, leaving their families in wagons to face a cold winter on the banks of the Missouri. Elder Taylor and his brethren spent 4 months in England, accomplishing the work they were assigned to do. In April 1847, when President Brigham Young and his pioneer company left for the West, Elder Taylor remained at winter quarters to organize the saints into groups which would soon follow. By the latter part of June, a large party of 1,533 people, hundreds of wagons, thousands of oxen, horses, and cows were ready to begin the 1,000-mile journey. Elders John Taylor and Parley P. Pratt presided over this large group. When the members of the caravan led by John Taylor approached the upper crossing of the Sweetwater, they discovered Brigham Young and the returning pioneers, who told them that a permanent gathering place for the saints had been selected in the Salt Lake Valley. To honor the returning pioneers, John Taylor requested the women of his company prepare a dinner for them.
Several improvised tables were covered with snow-white linen, which gave evidence that a surprise was in store for the weary pioneers. The fatted calf was killed. Game and fish were prepared in abundance. Fruits, jellies, and relishes for special occasions were brought out, until it truly was a royal feast. The dinner over, the brethren and sisters spent the evening in dancing. B. H. Roberts.
The following morning, President Brigham Young and his company traveled on to winter quarters, and John Taylor continued on to the Salt Lake Valley, where they arrived on the afternoon of October 5, 1847. Upon arriving in the Salt Lake Valley, John Taylor's first efforts were to build a home for himself and his family.
Our houses were built on the outside line of the fort in shanty form, the highest wall outside, the roof sloping toward the interior. The windows and doors were placed on the side facing the enclosure, the outside being left solid, excepting loopholes for protection. About Christmas 1847, I had put up, enclosed, and covered about 90 feet of building made of split logs. John Taylor.
John Taylor remained in the Salt Lake Valley for 2 years and took an active part in all the activities of the saints. Under every condition, John Taylor was a leader.
Many leaned on John Taylor's strength in those days. When despair settled over the colony, he infused it with hope. When the weak faltered, he strengthened them. Those cast down with sorrow, he comforted and cheered. His faith and trust in God and his power to preserve and deliver his people were unshaken in the midst of the difficulties they encountered in settling the desert valleys of Utah, as they had been in the midst of the mob violence in Missouri and Illinois. B. H. Roberts.
John Taylor was called by the First Presidency to introduce the gospel to the people of France. In Paris, he baptized a number of people and founded a small branch of the church. He also made arrangements for the publication of the Book of Mormon in the French language. In August 1851, Elder Taylor went to Hamburg, Germany, where he was successful in getting the Book of Mormon translated into German. Elder Taylor arrived back in Salt Lake City on August 20th, 1852, only to be sent east later that year to preside over churches in the eastern states, supervise immigration, and publish a paper in the interest of the church. In February of 1855, Elder Taylor established a paper in New York City called The Mormon. The daily newspapers of the time attacked his paper and the doctrines of the church, but Elder Taylor replied in a manner that often silenced his critics. In 1857, when President Buchanan ordered an army be sent to Utah, Elder Taylor felt he should travel back to Salt Lake City. Meanwhile, the United States Army was marching to the west and rapidly approaching the borders of Utah Territory. Captain Van Vliet, assistant quartermaster on General Haney's staff, arrived in Salt Lake City to purchase supplies for the oncoming forces and assure the people of Utah that the troops would not harm or molest them. The captain arrived and was received by Elder Taylor and other leading elders of the church. Captain Van Vliet's mission was unsuccessful. The saints would not sell him any supplies. Being in a wilderness and thousands of miles from other cities, their supplies were getting short. The saints had been told that the approaching army had been sent to put down the Mormon rebellion. There was no rebellion, but they were afraid to assist an army that was sent to destroy them. The captain learned that the Mormons had good reason for their point of view. He attended service the Sunday after he arrived. That day, Elder Taylor addressed the assembly.
What would be your feelings if the United States wanted to have the honor of driving us from our homes and bringing us subject to their depraved standard of moral and religious truth? Would you, if necessary, put the torch to your buildings and lay them in ashes and wander homeless into these mountains? I know what you would say and what you would do. John Taylor.
President Young asked for a vote. Elder Taylor said, "All you that are willing to set fire to your property and lay it in ashes, rather than submit to their military rule and oppression, manifest it by raising their hands." The congregation, numbering more than 4,000, unanimously raised their hands. To that, Elder Taylor said, "I know what your feelings are. We have been persecuted and robbed long enough, and in the name of Israel's God, we will be free." Captain Van Vliet admired the Mormons' courage, but was concerned for their safety. He pointed out that if the saints resisted the army on their borders, the next year they would see an overwhelming force sent to suppress them and punish them. The captain returned to the army on Ham's Fork deeply impressed with the seriousness and perhaps with the absurdity of the government's movement against Utah. The captain had become a friend of the Mormons, and his report to the Secretary of War made in Washington the following November did much in paving the way for an adjustment of the Utah difficulties. On August 29, 1877, Brigham Young died in Salt Lake City. His passing dissolved the first presidency and left the church without a president. For the next 3 years, President Taylor led the church as president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles.
President Taylor pushed forward with increased zeal for the work of the temples, of which 3 were being constructed. He required bishops to hold weekly priesthood meetings in their wards, presidents of stakes to hold general priesthood meetings monthly in their respective stakes, and appointed quarterly conferences in all the stakes of Zion, publishing the dates for holding them for a half-year in advance, a custom which has continued until present. B. H. Roberts.
President Taylor also stimulated the missionary work of the church by calling out a larger number of elders than had previously been sent into the world. The annual General Conference of the Church, held in April 1880, was known as the Jubilee Conference. It was the 50th anniversary of the organization of the church.
It occurred to me, on this occasion, that we ought to do something as they did in former times, to relieve those that are oppressed with debt, to assist those that are needy, to break off the yoke of those that may feel themselves crowded upon, and to make it a time of general rejoicing. John Taylor.
President Taylor explained that many of the saints were indebted to the Perpetual Emigration Fund for money that had been advanced to them by the church to help them emigrate to Zion. This large sum of money now amounted to well over $1 million. President Taylor proposed that 1/2 of this sum be remitted to the people, and that the worthy poor not be required to pay it all. At General Conference on October 10, 1880, John Taylor was sustained as prophet, seer, and revelator, and president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, with George Q. Cannon and Joseph F. Smith as his counselors. In the fall of 1881, the agitation of the country against the practice of polygamy in Utah became intense. Congress passed the Edmunds Bill, which provided fines and imprisonment for those who practiced polygamy. It also vacated the registration and election offices in Utah and placed the registration of voters and the management of elections under a federal board. At the April conference in 1882,
"We do not wish to place ourselves in a state of antagonism, nor act defiantly toward this government. We will fulfill the letter, so far as practicable, of that unjust, inhuman, oppressive, and unconstitutional law, so far as we can without violating principle. We shall abide all constitutional law, as we always have done, but while we are God-fearing and law-abiding, and respect all honorable men and officers, we are no craven serfs, and have not learned to lick the feet of oppressors, nor to bow in base submission to unreasonable clamor. We will contend inch by inch, legally and constitutionally, for our rights as American citizens. We need have no fears, no trembling in our knees about these attempts to deprive us of our God-given constitutional liberties. God will take care of His people, if we will only do right." John Taylor.
From 1883 to 1890, there were many prosecutions against the church under the Edmunds Law. In January 1885, President Taylor felt it was wise for him and a number of the Brethren of the 12 to leave Utah for a time, until things quieted down a bit. President Taylor returned to Salt Lake City on January 27th, where he learned that his arrest had been determined by non-Mormon officers. President Taylor went into retirement and was not found by the officers who sought him. He continued to direct the policies of the church and from time to time issued epistles addressed to the saints. In the summer of 1887, President Taylor's health began to fail. He passed away peacefully in Kaysville, Utah, on July 25th. At his bedside were members of his immediate family, along with his counselors, George Q. Cannon and Joseph F. Smith. At his death, his two counselors said that John Taylor would go down as a double martyr. First, that he mingled his blood with Joseph and Hiram at Carthage, and second, that he went into exile as a living martyr, denied the rights of citizenship in a country dedicated by its Constitution to genuine freedom of religion. The funeral for President John Taylor was held in the Tabernacle in Salt Lake City at 12 noon on Friday, July 29, 1887. Speakers included Franklin D. Richards, Heber J. Grant, and Lorenzo Snow. His body was laid to rest in the Salt Lake City Cemetery. I'm Nathan Wright, and you're listening to the Mormon Channel of The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.